Hi, folks. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're dialing in from today. It's 19th December, Thursday. I'm not traveling in time. This is the present moment where I'm presenting dry lab first versus wet lab first. So it's live. It's not scripted. It's basically not scripted at all. I'm going to speak my mind as I walk through some of my experience of building Scispot over the last few years, and also speaking to some of our amazing customers who are either dry lab first or wet lab first. So we'll dive into like some of their hybrid strategies and how I'm seeing biotech labs kind of evolving and what the future looks like. So we'll talk about that as well. And In the end, we will leave some time for questions. But yeah, let's get started. So welcome everybody who's dialed in. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about how biotech labs are evolving. And One thing that I'm noticing as a trend is wet labs are not working alone now. So there's really good components of like dry labs and models where AI-driven simulations are reshaping, very much like how Tesla factory do for cars, for instance. I'm seeing like a real good supply chain from data sets to predictive models, and tools like Schrodinger platform and tools like some of the AI-first biotech platform companies are evolving. And I go back to an example of like human cell atlas as a map, where this map guides us through biological system like GPS might guide self-driving cars, And I feel like this very much applies to anatomy of biotech labs on how wet lab and dry lab, when both join forces, how they describe or how they predict the future in a shorter amount of time, how the drug discovery life cycle, the testing life cycle is also reducing, how we can validate the hypothesis faster. So we'll look at some of those examples shortly. But let's start with the agenda before we move further. So in terms of the agenda, we'll cover the evolution of biotech, what we've seen so far. What does the past kind of teaches us in terms of where the wet lab versus dry lab is heading in the future, and especially with the foundation models and some of the LLMs work that both NVIDIA, Microsoft, hyperscaler AWS are doing, how that's also helping some of the biotech labs evolve into the future, and then also how Scispot is facilitating the handshakes between wet lab and dry labs. We'll look into some of the real world examples, some of the best practices that I've learned with my customers. And if you're a biotech founder listening in, how do you build scalable hybrid labs? So we'll talk about some of those examples as well, and then leave some time for Q&A on any kind of call to action, depending on the questions that you guys have. So yeah, let's talk about like dive right into the biotech founder journey. So let's say like you are a founder of a fictional biotech company. Let's call it BioNexus Therapeutics. And you have world-class wet lab scientists. You've raised millions of dollars to run this company, and you're basically chasing a rare cancer cure. But one thing you're noticing is it's slow. Like your hypothesis generation, validation is quite slow. That life cycle is kind of bringing you down. For example, you're facing a lot of failed experiments, and you're burning a lot of time, money, and value on those experiments. And a lot of this is happening because data is piling up, and you feel kind of stuck because it's really hard to generate quality data. It's getting easier to analyze that data. It's getting easier to use foundation models, but still, like simulation and foundation models and AI is only as good as like the capability to generate good quality of data, having good data integrity. So some of the examples that I've heard from the industry as what the founders face is simulation and validating hypothesis is not easy, especially in a traditional model of running a wet lab. And even if you kind of transform into an AI powered biotech company where you're basically building a foundational model for your pipeline, sometimes you get into a position where you have failed experiments that have burned a lot of money, and you kind of pivot to a small molecule which you know to be true. You have decent number of I've seen decent number of companies in the market who have pivoted to known druggable targets or familiar druggable targets with proven chemotherapy, for instance. or they pivot to antibody drug conjugates, ADCs. And sometimes, like all of these pivots, you reach a point of no return. And at that point, you think, okay, what could I have done better? How do I go back to first principles? And I'm seeing this both from biotech labs that started as wet lab first or started as dry lab first. And the answer is like not one or the other, but the answer is how do I have a game plan that if I'm building a biotech platform company, how do I reduce this whole hypothesis generation and the validation cycle times? And how do I make sure I get quality data sets and data integrity is maintained? So we'll look into some of those examples of how to reduce the resource strain, especially in the world where the data is getting overloaded. We have high throughput of data coming from different signals, if you will, as you build your biotech company. So this is like a very common challenge that I've seen biotech companies facing. So this evolution kind of brings me back to thinking of the whole biotech lab as a wet lab first to hybrid approach, or even as a dry lab first to a hybrid model. Back in 2000, labs used to rely on like brute force. So there were computational limits, both from like the ability to generate data, but also be able to validate the hypothesis. And what a typical biotech founder would run into is endless number of experiments with like often getting to dead ends. It was like designing rockets by trial and error with no simulation. And today, like we can map a lot of potential compounds in silico. For example, Schrodinger platform lets you test 10,000 molecules overnight before one hits the bench, right? So your lab kind of shifts from trial and error to a very guided mission. And I feel like early AI drug discovery started at like in a siloed approach of like wet lab first or even dry lab first, but it was really hard to get to mature models and basically build active learning cycles. And I don't think it's about building cool platforms. It's more about collecting and refining meaningful data. So that's why I think having a hybrid lab approach where you blend AI prediction with real patient-derived biological data, and using rapid bench style validation. So you start as a dry lab first and then do bench side validation. So having a wet lab that can validate some of those data points and generate good quality of data is where the industry is heading. And with smarter foundation models and more relevant data sets, I feel like hybrid labs let us filter candidates really quickly in silico before even testing only the most promising ones at the bench. And this data driven loop of like collecting patient data, refining models, validating in the wet lab, and iterating really fast, it speeds up the discovery and increases the odds of clinical success. So a lot of Scispot customers that I'm speaking to, what they are doing now is they're basically starting with a dry lab, but then very quickly spinning up a wet lab to validate the hypothesis, but also using wet lab to generate good quality data as well. And there's a quick kind of feedback iterative loop that keeps the data integrity going. So I feel like that's where most of the biotech is kind of heading, where it's not just like one or the other, but more of an hybrid approach. So in this hybrid approach, I think one of the things that becomes really important is how do you become a differentiated player as you're entering the market? And I really like this LinkedIn post from Arish, where he's kind of talked about wave one, wave two, wave three, and then eventually wave four labs, and what this shift kind of entails as the data explodes. And within wave four, it's basically highly relevant data generation, which becomes very important. And for that, I feel like hybrid labs play a very important role. So you generate good quality of data and you use AI as a tool within a well-designed workflow that focuses on translating leads into real trial-ready drug candidates. And it's not like wave one is not no longer relevant. I think pre-AI wave one was really relevant, where the focus was structure-based drug design for small molecules, primarily using molecular dynamics and simulation modeling. But I think with hybrid labs, we are seeing a lot of biotech companies spinning up as dry labs but then later down the line, using wet lab to validate their hypothesis. So more like a validation and testing technique. And as a result, they're basically reducing the cycle time of their testing, reducing the time it takes to validate the hypothesis, but also the time it takes to create good quality of data. And now you might ask, like, why is this shift kind of exploding? And I feel like it's because AI tools are getting more sophisticated, but also the amount of data biotech is generating is, in terms of volume, is more than astronomy data by 2025. So it's kind of crazy if you mix the high volume of data and also look at how some of the models are getting so accurate, and the cost of compute is going to go down in the next few years. I feel like having this hybrid approach makes a ton of sense. Okay, so we talked about like the data explosion. We talked about the evolution of biotech. We also talked about some of the real world examples. But what does this trend means in terms of running a biotech company and in terms of using tool sets to augment the data generation and data validation? What does that mean? So um, I remember 4 years ago when we were onboarding customers to Scispot platform, most of their questions were around how would my wet lab scientist use a particular feature. Then over the years, the question became, um, my wet lab scientists are really happy, but now they want to do handshakes with some of the computational biologists. So what does that API first approach looks like? So Scispot was built with API first and GUI first mindset. So we started talking about what does that interface looks like between wet lab and dry labs. And recently, the kind of questions I'm getting from customers is like, I want to design the data dictionary in Scispot using API. And then within that data dictionary, I want to be able to help wet lab scientists run experiments using natural language. So I feel like I'm already seeing that shift of hybrid model from a tooling standpoint. Um, and also with AI ML advances, I'm seeing a lot of non-technical folks be able to do things that only computational biologists, for instance, used to be able to do a few years ago. So this shift is being seen not just in like AI first companies, for example, Recursion, but I'm seeing this shift in Schrodinger, which is physics first company, and Amgen, which started as a wet lab first company. So all of these companies are now morphing towards this new generation of hybrid model, if you will. It's not like the modern company is going to adopt it, but also companies who've been operating for a decade are also morphing into um, automating the wet lab steps, but also be able to use robots that pipetted samples with machine-like precisions, and then feeding that information back to the computational pipelines. And how the future is evolving is with a high predictive feedback loop that goes between wet lab and computational pipelines, if you will. And it's pretty fascinating because if you're starting as an AI first company, you are also looking at wet lab practices. And if you're a decade old company who have really optimized your wet lab workflows, you're now bridging the gap between wet lab and your computational pipelines. So, what becomes important is the feedback loop and also the kind of tooling that you use to connect between these two bridges. Because in the past, wet lab and dry lab were like two different highways, and it was really hard to connect them with a bridge. And I feel like now the foundation is the bridge where you're starting with that connection and then building the wet lab and dry lab as a strong foundation. Great. So now let's talk about some of the roles of computational workflows. So as you build more and more AI first biotech platforms, a lot of companies are starting with computational first approach. So what does that entail? If you start as the dry lab first biotech company, data integration, predictive modeling, AI ML feedback, and automation becomes very important. In the past, if you were starting as a wet lab first company, the graphical user interface or the tooling of like collecting data, assimilating data was very important. But now it's not just important. the predictive modeling becomes way more fundamental than just assimilating and connecting data. But the foundation of all of this is the feedback loop. If you don't have a good feedback loop between how your wet lab workflows work and how the data simulation works, I think all of this breaks. So computational workflows becomes really important. And you can blend like genomics, proteomics, and imaging data in one platform, for example, if you have a good computational pipeline built in. And what this does is it turns like siloed workflows into actionable insights for you. For instance, wet lab confirms only the winners, saving weeks per iteration, but the feedback loop between wet lab and computational workflows improves the cycle of learning and refining. It's like training self-driving cars with every new mile that that car has run. So let's take an example. Imagine your lab collects patient tumor DNA, protein expression profiles, and high resolution cell images. You need all these layers of data into one unified platform. The AI kind of sifts through the noise, identifies a handful of molecules with the best chance of hitting your target, and flags them for testing, right? So instead of screening thousands of molecules blindly, your wet lab comes in place, which focuses on just a few top leads. And after running these experiments, the results loop back into the system. So back into that computational pipeline, helping the model learn what worked and what did not. And then as you go through these iterations over time, it's like calibrating an autopilot, right? So each trip refines the guidance, bringing you closer to a successful drug candidate faster. And this is a really good example of that marriage between your dry lab and wet lab. So with these synergies, I feel like wet lab has become more of a validation and data generation pillar, while dry lab is becoming more of a prediction and an optimization pillar. And I think as a result, what becomes really important um, is what tool set do you use? How do you change the mindset of the wet lab scientists that you have on your team and the computational biologists that you have in your team? What is their mental model? Can you align those two mental models in one platform, and not just from a tooling standpoint, but data principle standpoint? Do you have the underlying data integrity layer? For example, I was speaking to a customer last week, and the dry lab persona is thinking about more rigid way of defining the data dictionary, so their models don't break downstream. However, in the same company, the wet lab persona is talking about flexibility, configurability. They need metadata on demand, be able to like configure things on demand through graphical user interface. So that dichotomy of like two different mental models should be aligned on one data principle. Otherwise, it's really hard to build a data pipeline in place that can bridge the gap between wet lab and dry lab. So coming back to that hypothetical example of like, if you're building BioNexus Therapeutics today, a fictional biotech AI company, you want to think about, if you're starting as dry lab first, make sure that the data principles you define, the mental models you define, also aligns with the wet lab that might come in few months, few years down the line. And what does that look like? So in terms of tooling and best practices, you want to make sure that you start small. So a lot of biotech AI companies that I'm seeing are starting with their own small foundation models, if you will. They're building hybrid teams where they're aligning the mental models between computational biologists and wet lab scientists. And as a result, they're integrating their data and tool sets between these two distinct personas. And I feel like in a decade, a lot of wet lab scientists would be able to do things that computational biologists do today, using natural language or using tool sets that can sit on top of small language models, because the models are getting better. So for example, Scispot is part of the NVIDIA Inception program, and I'm already looking at BioNemo and some of the other models that NVIDIA offers. And I've seen the accuracy go up exponentially over the last 6 months. I'm also seeing that the computational cost is also going down. That only means that more and more wet lab scientists would be able to do a lot more technical things that were unheard of a few years ago, right? And that's why I think aligning both wet lab and computational folks on a similar dimension or same dimension makes a ton of sense for these hybrid labs to be successful. And then how Scispot is helping do that transition and bridging the gap between two distinct persona together is building a graphical database that is scalable. In 2010s, the data management platform started as data warehouse. Um, then I remember I used to work so I come from travel tech. My brother is a molecular biologist who's the CEO of Scispot. I remember in early 2010s when I was working at hotels.com, the Hadoop as a big data came in, and everybody was using Hadoop in those days. And then in 2015, I remember NoSQL databases became really popular in the industry. But now, like with Snowflake, Neo4j, and few other companies, I'm seeing graphical databases are becoming really popular. So I've seen that kind of data engineering evolution. In a similar fashion in biotech, I'm seeing people are realizing that building ontologies is becoming easier. Um, Now what's more important is the quality of the underlying data, because if you have good underlying data, um, building ontologies has become a lot easier using AI powered tools. So that's where kind of SciSpot comes in. As you're building a hybrid lab, your foundation is strong. You can build your data model. As a computational person, you can define what that data dictionary looks like before a single wet lab person comes in picture. And as a wet lab scientist, you can define your own configurability and do things that only computational folks used to be able to do in the past. And you're not passing the baton between different teams, but you're collaborating and doing seamless integration in one platform. And I think why this is more important is we can move away from this old school jargons of like electronic lab notebook, lab information management system, and move more towards how do I record every experiment seamlessly, where my lab notes are not just unstructured data, but it can be converted into structured, whether that's a JSON format or structured graphical ontologies. And I should be able to use natural language to write SQL queries or write Python scripts or do data analysis. That's not only deterministic, uh, but also be able to get high accuracy without hallucination. And I'm already seeing that as models are getting better and better, all of this is becoming very much feasible. And I would highly encourage you that if you are a biotech founder who's thinking to start a biotech AI company, think of this hybrid approach. Think of how do I start as a dry lab first or a wet lab first, and then use the other side of the fence to build diverse data sets and be able to reduce that cycle of validating the hypothesis, and be able to get to quality candidates faster.